Good morning. On the 10th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 10 lords a-leaping. I'm guessing that's some level of nobility doing some dancing that was probably a customary dance at the time. Probably not something we'd find too attractive. It'd have to be like the equivalent of, I don't know, rappers dancing. I don't know. It's just weird that our culture doesn't have communal dancing as a part of its regular practice anymore. So anyway, 10 lords a leaping, or maybe they helped smash mole holes in the backyard. I'm not sure there. Symbolically, it represents the Ten Commandments. Probably the first version that Moses brings down in Exodus 20, which didn't have much of a shelf life because it broke and was shattered in his anger and disappointment with the Israelites. The copy of Ten Commandments that actually was carried in the Ark of the Covenant is the version that was given 2.0, given in chapter 34, which is very, very different. A couple similarities, but mostly vastly different than the original 10. And yet most of us are unaware of those, and they certainly aren't the 10 Commandments that are posted or put on in public places. So just something to think about and consider. Go back and read Exodus 34 and see how different they are. But we are on the 10th day of Christmas and continuing through Walter Angren's The Book of God, the fictional retelling of the Bible. And this is his imaginative version on day 10 as we continue to make the path, the journey with Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. So Mary rode slowly toward Bethlehem, and Joseph led the donkey, but Mary's condition controlled its speed, and the beast walked with a long bobbing of its head. The enrollment had already begun before the tiny family arrived, and Bethlehem's regular activities had been drowned in the great flood of Jews. Children of David filled the village and the hillsides around and about. And the Roman officials had established their booths on Ridge Road, which went north from Hebron to Jerusalem and passed directly through Bethlehem. Citizens waiting to register stood in long lines from morning till afternoon. Then they ate and they rested, and most would return to the census takers again tomorrow. It was a monumentally slow process. The inns were crowded, strangers slept side by side on the earthen floors or in lofts, and the owners of the inns withdrew to the smaller private rooms built on the roofs of their buildings. It was dusk when Joseph led his donkey and his wife through the gate and into the village. And though there were few people wandering the streets, he knew immediately how burdened Bethlehem was with humanity. The very air vibrated with the breathings, the low murmurings, and the talk of 10,000 people was like hornets humming inside a hive. But Mary had begun to glisten in the moonlight. And more she was leaning back against the ridge of her wooden saddle, grimacing, and her teeth shone white. Just once as they approached the gate, she had whispered, "It's time, Joseph, it's time, now." She did not have to repeat it. The word had triggered soft explosions in his brain. "It's time, Joseph." The glistening on her brow was sweat, and for a moment the carpenter felt completely helpless. Mary must not bear the baby in the open, in some dark corner. Yet he could think of no place which could accommodate them, and every human den or nest was inhabited. The dark village was a crush of population. The donkey shook its head and began moving on its own accord, and it shuffled into an easy trot, and Joseph called sharply twice for a halt, but because the beast continued trotting, he was forced to run alongside, gripping Mary's wrists in one hand and bracing her back with the other. "Joseph, it's time," rang through his head. And the donkey took a narrow street downhill. It wound around a large inn to the back where a cave had been dug as a sort of basement in limestone, and here Joseph smelled the warm, consoling odor of many beasts, the russet sting of clean, dry hay. And the cave was enclosed by a rude wooden fence, and the donkey stopped at a gate and waited. And Mary gasped, and Joseph could hear the grinding of her teeth and a deep internal moaning. "It's time. It's time." He lifted the wooden bar of the gate, and immediately the donkey entered and walked to the back of the cave where several feed troughs had been carved into the virgin stone. and other beasts were lying around on the straw, swung their heavy heads to watch the new intrusion. And Mary cried out and fell from the donkey, and Joseph caught her. Her body astonished him. It was like iron ingots, heavy, hard. All her muscles doubled down and flexing. She screamed. And with his feet, Joseph kicked around a huge pile of clean straw, and he laid Mary there, and he laid her down in such a way that her robe became her bedding, covering all the straw beneath her. And suddenly Mary threw back her head and bent her torso up at the belly and crouched forward, howling Joseph's name. And for the second time that night, Joseph felt completely helpless. His face was on fire with fear and foolishness. He was not a midwife. But Mary reached and grabbed his big hands and pressed the palms of them into her vulva, crying, "Not yet, not yet. Hold it in, Joseph. Hold it back till I'm ready." And he felt the baby. And Joseph felt the round crown of the baby's head, slick and warm and pulsing. Pushing out of Mary, it seemed to the carpenter that he had just fallen off the top of the high cliff and that he'd soon hit stones below, but the drop between was breathless and exhilarating. And gently he pushed back, denying the child's entrance into the world. And Mary was twisting her body around, first to her left side and then over her hands and her knees, and Joseph kept his hands in place, and overcome by his wife's extraordinary strength and wisdom. "Steady me," she cried. "Get behind me, Joseph. Don't let me fall." She rocked on her heels, and she rocked back against the huge chest of her husband, and he released the infant's head between her legs and caught the woman at the hips. And now Mary was squatting, her knees straining apart, hunched her body down. She started screaming. The sound was cut to solid silence by the monstrous effort that she was making. And Joseph trembled. His throat was raw. He smelled the mossy scent of Mary's sweating. Her hair was a thick tangle under his face, and all filled with dust and straw. And now a squeal, thin as a harp string, endlessly long, began to sing in the cave stable. Ee. And Joseph felt the sound between the arms. And it was Mary's tiny cry, growing stronger, growing louder, never breaking for a breath, a surge of power gathering within her and driving downward, driving her baby out into the world now. And there was a quick slurping sound, and suddenly a baby lay on its back in the straw under his mother, his face confronting Mary's face directly, and she burst into tears. And she fell backward, exhausted against Joseph, howling in delight and relief at the pain and in great sorrow. And the baby kicked and wrinkled his face and began to cry. And Mary reached up and pawed the beard of her husband. Then she was pulling him down by it. "Wash him. Wash him. Wash my baby. Wash the blood away. Wash him perfectly clean. Wash him and salt him and bring me my knife." And Joseph stood up, and his muscles did not want to stretch, and he walked like a drunk man to the knapsacks and found there a linen cloth that Mary had packed for the baby, and also salt and a lantern and a knife. And when he knelt down and lit the lantern, he saw Mary in the grip of another task, bent forward, pushing against something else inside of her, as if there was another baby coming. And he also saw what a quantity of blood and water had soaked into the straw between her legs, and he pitied his wife. And the infant, streaked with mucus and blood, as he watched it, he watched the tiny body turn from blue to a light pink and then to a rose color, as if small fires had begun to burn within him. And he wiped the baby clean. The baby sighed, and Joseph could not stand the glory of the moment, the baby sighing. And Mary uttered a final shout, and the afterbirth flushed out, and now she looked as wet and exhausted as gravestones after a rain. "Joseph," she whispered, "please bring him here." And Joseph laid the baby upon Mary's breast. And Mary bit linen and tore off thin strip. With this she tied a knot in the cord that had connected the holy child to her body, and she took the knife and cut the connection forever. And both the mother and the baby cried. "Jesus," she whispered. She gathered him to her bosom and rocked him. "Jesus, Jesus, little Leshy, here you are, and I love you." Mary opened the linen cloth. Slowly she began to wrap it around the baby, tight enough to assure him that he was still embraced as in the womb, tight enough to be her love upon him even after separation, loose enough to allow the child to live and breathe on his own. And in the lantern light, Joseph saw the great beasts surrounding them. They'd raised their heads. Sniffing the air, perhaps a birthing scent spoke even to them of primal matters. Joseph? Yes, he responded. Do you want to hold your baby? And the huge man was a plain ox, thick in all his parts, a heavy, ruinous creature. And the child in his arms was so light, composed of such crushable sticks. And Jesus opened his eyes and looked at the huge head and the beard above him, and little Jesus gazed at the hairy ox, and he was not afraid. And therefore Joseph, filled with a sense of his undeserving, began to weep, and quickly laid the tiny boy in a feed trough for safekeeping and for sleeping. And Mary whispered, You see, you bore the baby too. Ah, Mary was generous and beautiful, and she put her swollen fingers to her brow and wiped the sticking strands of black hair back. Joseph, she said softly, would you come here with your clean clothes? Husband, would you darken the lantern and come and wash me too? And would you wash all of my parts clean again? A beautiful version of the story. The climax of the celebration that we've been preparing for, some since Thanksgiving or before. And here we are. With a few more days, we'll continue to tell the story of the shepherds being visited by the angels and the wise men traveling from far away, from the lands of the east, to come and worship. Happy 10th day of Christmas, and welcome again to the new year.